She asked me if I loved her right before she told me she didn't want me there. I have replayed that moment more times than I can count. Not because it broke me, because it told me everything I needed to know about what had been happening inside my daughter's heart, and who had been working on it. My name is Olivia Mossely. I am a senior nurse. I have spent 31 years learning how to stay calm when everything around me is falling apart. That Tuesday evening, I needed every one of those years. Lachette chose the restaurant, the kind of place where the lighting is soft and the portions are small, and everything costs more than it should. We were seated by 7. James was across from me, Lachette between us. For the first 20 minutes, it was ordinary enough. I asked about the venue. She answered in short sentences. James ate, without looking up once. I told myself it was nerves. Wedding planning is stressful. I let it go. Then Lachette set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Calm, rehearsed, like she had practiced the distance. Mom, do you love me? Of course I do. Sure, baby. I meant it without a single hesitation. She nodded slowly, like my answer was the key she needed to open the next door. Then I don't want you at my wedding. Just pay the bills. I heard it. Every word. I sat with it for 3 full seconds while the restaurant kept moving around us. A waiter passing, glasses clinking somewhere behind me. The quiet hum of other people's ordinary evenings. James kept eating. He didn't pause, didn't look up, didn't shift in his seat. That stillness told me more than anything Lachette had said. A man hearing something this sharp for the first time moves. He reacts. He doesn't sit there cutting his steak like the air hasn't changed. This conversation had been rehearsed. He had been in the room when it was written. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I picked up my napkin, folded it once, set it beside my plate, and stood up. I touched nothing else on the table. I didn't look at James. I looked at my daughter for exactly 1 moment, long enough to see that she was waiting to see what I would do. And then I walked out. The drive home was quiet. No radio, no tears. I had been watching James Whitfield for 2 years. I had seen the way he repositioned every conversation about me until I sounded like a threat. I had watched my daughter stop calling on Sundays. I had tried twice to speak to her directly, and twice she had chosen him over the truth. I had already decided before I sat down that whatever happened at that table would be the last time I reacted instead of moved. He wanted me humiliated and silent. He had miscalculated on both. I would pay for the wedding, not because he won, because I had already made a decision that required him to believe he had. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark. What time are you watching this? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who's up with me tonight. I wasn't angry. I was ready. And I had already begun. The dinner didn't start at the restaurant. It started 6 months earlier on a Tuesday morning when a stranger found me through my daughter's Instagram page. I was on my lunch break at the hospital when the message came in. I almost ignored it. The account had no profile photo, barely any followers, and a name I didn't recognize. But the first line stopped me cold. I know James Whitfield. And I think you need to know what I know. Her name doesn't matter for this story. I will call her the woman who found me. She had been involved with James in Atlanta for nearly 2 years. Serious enough to meet family. Serious enough to believe they had a future. She had also worked as a vendor connected to the company where James handled procurement. Before she contacted me, she spent months debating whether she should. She told me that herself later. At first, she tried to move on. Then she saw Lachette's engagement photos online and recognized James immediately. She said she stared at the pictures for 2 days before finally messaging me because she couldn't watch another woman walk into the same situation without at least trying to warn someone. What she sent wasn't gossip. It was documentation, emails, bid records, internal messages, evidence that James had been steering contracts toward vendors who paid him privately. When the company began quietly reviewing irregularities, James negotiated a resignation before the investigation fully matured. He relocated to North Carolina, and the matter faded before becoming public. The woman who found me was left holding records nobody wanted anymore. I did not believe everything immediately. I spent nearly 2 weeks verifying what I could through a retired HR director I had worked with years earlier. A woman who understood how internal investigations moved and what legitimate documentation actually looked like. Even then, there were pieces we couldn't fully confirm, but enough of it aligned cleanly enough to matter. I sat with all of that for a long time, because the hardest part wasn't the paperwork. It was the fact that I had already been watching James work on my daughter long before the message arrived. Not loudly, quietly. The Sunday calls from Lachette started thinning out around 4 months into their relationship. James never directly told her to stop calling me. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he reframed what the calls meant: dependency, immaturity, a grown woman still emotionally attached to her mother. He did the same thing with holidays, traditions, the old movies Lachette used to watch with me after hard weeks. Slowly, carefully, he turned familiar comforts into evidence that she hadn't fully grown up. And after enough time, she started repeating his framing back to me in her own voice. That part hurt more than the silence. I tried speaking to her directly twice. The first time she told me I was reading too much into things. The second conversation ended with 3 weeks of silence between us afterward. After that, I stopped pushing. When the woman from Atlanta sent me those records, I understood something clearly. Talking was never going to be enough anymore. James had already built the wall. He used my daughter's love for him as the mortar. So I stopped looking for a door in that wall. I started paying attention to the foundation underneath it. By then, the Sunday calls had been gone for months. Every week, without hearing her voice, settled into me quietly. Not dramatically, just persistently. Like touching the same missing tooth over and over without meaning to. That was when I stopped hoping things would correct themselves, and started moving carefully instead. People asked me afterward how I could pay for a wedding I wasn't invited to attend. I understood the question. From the outside, it looked like surrender. It wasn't. I sat with that decision for nearly a week after the dinner. Part of me wanted to pull every dollar back immediately and let James discover what his plans looked like without my money underneath them. The hurt part of me wanted that. But I knew James too well by then. Not the version Lachette knew, the attentive man who made her feel chosen. I knew the version underneath that. The man who could turn any situation into proof that he was the victim if given the right opening. If I withdrew the money, he would hand Lachette a story instantly. Your mother abandoned you. Your mother chose pride over love. Your mother never wanted this marriage to work. And at that point, my daughter would have believed him. So I paid. Every invoice. Quietly. Not because he won, because I refused to give him a weapon he hadn't earned. 2 weeks before the wedding, I made a call. Even then, I hesitated longer than people probably imagine. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with the number written on paper beside me, wondering if I was about to step too far into something that might not move at all. The man I contacted worked in compliance adjacent to the procurement world James operated in. We weren't close friends, more like professionals who had crossed paths enough times over the years to recognize each other's names. At first, he didn't want involvement. He told me directly over the phone that internal matters inside large companies often disappeared quietly unless the documentation was airtight. He also warned me that passing information upward didn't guarantee action. I respected him more for saying that. So I sent only what could be verified clearly. The vendor communications, bid records, internal inconsistencies that repeated too many times to ignore comfortably. Then I waited. For several days, nothing happened. Long enough that I genuinely considered the possibility that the company would bury it quietly, and James would walk straight into marriage untouched. Then, the compliance contact called back. Not with promises, just with confirmation that the information had been forwarded internally for review. That was enough. I didn't need a dramatic takedown. I only needed movement already happening beneath James's feet before he reached that altar, believing he had secured everything permanently. The wedding happened on a Saturday. I was not there. People I knew attended naturally. Friends of the family, longtime connections, people who cared enough afterward to tell me what the day looked like. James gave a speech at the reception. He thanked everyone for celebrating what he had built and provided for his new wife. He accepted congratulations inside a room my money had paid for, down to the flowers on the tables. I listened to the retelling the next morning over coffee. I didn't feel anger. Anger is loud. What I felt was quieter than that. The feeling of watching someone celebrate stability while standing over ground already beginning to shift underneath them. By then, the internal review had already started inside his company. Nothing public, nothing explosive, just questions beginning in rooms James didn't know were talking about him yet. That Saturday night, I sat alone in my living room. No television, no music, just silence and the understanding that there was nothing left inside me still debating what came next. I was not bitter. I was not broken. And I was not the woman James thought he dismissed at that dinner table. I was ready. 4 days after the wedding, Lachette called me at 9 in the evening, and I knew before she spoke that something had shifted. Her voice had that particular tightness to it. The kind that means a person has been holding something all day and has finally run out of room to hold it. She didn't open with hello. She said, "Mama, James lost his job today." I let a beat pass. What happened? She didn't fully know. He had come home in the middle of the afternoon, which was unusual. He told her the company had let him go, that an internal review had surfaced something from his past, that the whole thing had come from nowhere, that someone had set him up. He was angry in the way frightened men get angry, loud about everything except the actual truth. "He keeps saying someone did this to him," Lachette said. "You think that's possible?" "I think people in those kinds of positions make enemies," I said carefully. "How are you doing? Do you have what you need at home?" She paused at that. My question had moved past James and she noticed. "We're fine. The timing is strange, Mama. 4 days after the wedding." I said. "You don't think it's strange?" "I think life doesn't wait for convenient moments," I said. "Is he managing himself? Is he calm?" She hesitated just long enough to tell me he wasn't. But she said yes. She said he was fine. She protected him even then, in that first phone call, even when her voice was telling a different story than her words. We talked for another few minutes. I asked if she had eaten. She said she had. I told her to get some rest, and that I loved her. The call ended warmly, warm enough that she wouldn't feel the distance I was keeping on purpose. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there in the quiet. The internal review had concluded faster than I expected. The compliance professional I had passed the documentation to was thorough. That was why I had chosen him. The bid records, the vendor payments, the pattern of steered contracts. It was enough. More than enough. James's employer in Charlotte had terminated him the same way his Atlanta employer had wanted to, but hadn't. Quietly, finally, and without room to negotiate his way out this time. He had told Lachette someone set him up. He was not wrong. He simply had no idea where to look, because he had never considered that the woman he dismissed from that restaurant table was the kind of woman who moved before she spoke. I had not placed this domino the night of the dinner. I had not placed it the night of the wedding. I had placed it the day the Atlanta woman found me in my inbox on a Tuesday lunch break, the day I stopped talking and started moving. Everything between that moment and this phone call had been nothing but timing. James was sitting somewhere in that apartment right now, building a list of enemies in his head. Former colleagues, rivals, someone from Atlanta who had finally come for him. He was thinking in every direction. He never once looked behind him. That was always going to be his mistake. Men like James spend so much energy managing what is in front of them that they forget to account for what they left in their wake. The first domino was down. I washed my cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. There was more to do, and I was not in any hurry. 10 days after the wedding, my daughter called me from a bathroom. I knew, because of the acoustics, that hollow echo of tile and closed doors. I had heard it years earlier when she was 16 and trying not to let her friends hear her cry. Now, at 31, she was doing the same thing. Finding the smallest room in the apartment so James wouldn't hear her reaching for me. She didn't begin with the real problem. She talked around it first. A bill that arrived that morning. A missed phone call James wouldn't explain. The strange feeling that had settled over the apartment since he stopped going to work every day. I let her circle it. Eventually, the truth came out in pieces. Their savings were moving faster than she expected. James kept insisting opportunities were coming, but his confidence no longer matched the way he looked when he thought she wasn't paying attention. He stayed awake at night, snapped at her over small things, apologized afterward in ways that somehow felt more unsettling than the anger itself. She talked for a long time. I listened. When she finally went quiet, I waited one more second before speaking. "Oh, baby," I said softly. "I just got started." The words came out colder than I intended. I felt it immediately. The silence afterward stretched long enough for me to count it. 4 seconds. 5. "What does that mean?" she asked finally. Her voice had changed, not just tired anymore, alert. "It means what it sounds like." "Mama." Now the word came tight. "Did you have something to do with this?" There it was. Not fully formed suspicion yet, but close enough to touch. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes for a moment before answering. "I told you before the wedding that James wasn't who he pretended to be." "That's not what I asked." "No," I said quietly. "It isn't." Another silence. I could hear her breathing through the phone. Fast, controlled, trying not to become emotional before she understood what emotion she was even feeling. Part of her already knew. I think that was what frightened her most. "I love you," I said. "That has never changed. That is not an answer either. It's the only one I can give you tonight." She pulled in a breath sharp enough for me to hear the frustration inside it. Then she said she didn't know why she still called me sometimes. That every conversation with me lately left her feeling more unsettled than comforted. Her voice cracked once on the word unsettled, and she corrected it quickly. I didn't defend myself. There was nothing useful in defending myself. "Everything happening right now started before the wedding," I said carefully. "Long before that dinner table. That's all I'm going to tell you." The line went quiet again. This time, the silence felt different. Thinking silence. The kind where someone is replaying old conversations in real time and discovering new meanings inside them. I knew she was remembering the restaurant now. The folded napkin, the calm way I walked out, the fact that I never argued once. "What did he do?" she asked suddenly. Not, "What did you do?" What did he do? That mattered. I looked toward the dark bedroom window. "Eat something tonight," I said softly. "Try to sleep. I love you." She didn't say it back, but she also didn't argue again. She hung up quietly. I sat there holding the phone for a moment after the call ended. Not with regret, exactly. More with the understanding that somewhere inside all of this, my daughter was still the person I had been trying to reach. James was somewhere on the other side of that bathroom door, still building theories in every direction except the correct one. He thought the worst had already happened. He had no idea the real collapse had only just started. The first envelope arrived on a Wednesday. Lachette called me about it without calling it what it was. She said a credit statement had come in her name for an account she didn't recognize. The balance was $4,000 and change. She assumed it was an error. She was going to call the bank. Her voice was steady the way voices get when a person is working hard to believe their own explanation. I told her to call the bank. I told her to write down everything the representative said. I told her to keep the envelope. 3 days later, there was another one. Different account, similar balance. Then a loan statement, a personal loan taken out 6 weeks before the wedding, both their names on it. A balance she had never seen or signed for in any moment she could remember. She confronted James. She told me about it afterward in pieces, the way you describe something your mind is still trying to organize. She had asked him directly, "Whose accounts are these? When did you take this loan? Why is my name on something I never agreed to?" He had answered her. Technically. He had used words that sounded like explanations without actually explaining anything. And when she pressed a second time, he did the same thing with different words. The third time she asked, he didn't use words at all. He didn't strike her. I want to be precise about that, because the distinction matters to people who have never been in a room with a man who has decided to remind you of his size without touching you. He blocked the doorway when she moved toward it. He took her wrist when she reached for her phone, not violently, firmly, in the way that communicates that your movement is not your own decision right now. He brought his face close to hers and spoke in a register she had never heard from him before. Quiet, controlled, specific. Then he stepped back, adjusted his shirt, and told her she was overreacting. She didn't call me that night. The next morning she stood in the bathroom and looked at her wrist in the light. There was bruising along the inside where his fingers had been. She stood there for a long time. Then she took out her phone and photographed it. She told me later she didn't fully know why she did it in that moment. It wasn't a decision exactly, more like something her body understood before her mind caught up. She created a folder, locked it with a separate code, and put the photo inside. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to make breakfast, like nothing had happened. Because that is what you do when you are not ready to name what is happening. You make breakfast. You keep moving. You tell yourself it was the stress. James had also started a new pattern by then. Every conversation about money, about the apartment, about dinner, about nothing, eventually arrived at the same place. Olivia. Her mother was the interference. Her mother had never accepted him. Her mother was the reason the energy in their home felt wrong. If Lachette would simply create distance from that relationship, everything else would find its balance. Lachette stopped responding to that part. She didn't argue. She didn't agree. She just let it pass through the room without landing. That was new. James noticed. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. That evening, she locked her phone and set it face down on the nightstand. She didn't know yet what she was building inside that folder. She didn't know yet that she was already protecting herself. But she was. While James was home cycling through theories, I was making my second move. It was quieter than the first. The compliance review that cost him his job had been direct. Documentation, formal process, visible consequence. What I did next left no paperwork at all. Through years in hospital procurement, I knew people across overlapping professional circles. Not close friends, just enough connections built over conferences, vendor meetings, and long careers spent around the same kinds of rooms. Two of those contacts had indirect ties to procurement circles connected to James's old Atlanta employer. Not close enough to know details, close enough to recognize what certain documentation suggested. I did not contact them myself. At first I considered it, then decided against it. Too risky, too personal. Instead, I passed limited information through a colleague who agreed only to say there were concerns around James's prior professional conduct that people might want to look into before attaching their names to him. One of the men never responded at all. The other sent back a short message. "Appreciate the heads up. I'll be careful." That was it. No dramatic takedown, no secret campaign. Just hesitation introduced into rooms where James needed confidence to survive. At the time, James had been building toward a consulting arrangement that could have stabilized everything for him financially. A soft landing after losing his position. The kind of opportunity built mostly on reputation and trust. But losing the Charlotte job had already started damaging him before anything I passed along ever reached anybody. People in those circles notice sudden departures. They ask questions quietly. Sometimes hesitation spreads on its own. For a while, nothing happened. Then meetings started getting postponed. Calls stretched farther apart. One conversation James expected to lead somewhere suddenly stalled without explanation. Even then, I didn't know if it was because of what I sent, because of his termination itself, or because people in those circles had already begun hearing things independently. Professional networks talk quietly long before they speak openly. I only knew momentum had changed. Lachette mentioned it one evening without realizing what she was describing. She said James had been waiting on an opportunity that suddenly felt uncertain. That he kept checking his phone more often. That he seemed irritated by silence he couldn't control. She also said he had started interviewing differently. Shorter answers, more defensiveness. Too eager sometimes. Distracted other times. The kind of small shifts people notice when someone is under pressure, whether they understand the reason or not. At home, he had recalibrated too. The wrist incident had been a loss of control, and James was not careless enough to repeat visible mistakes quickly. What replaced it was subtler. He became attentive at unpredictable moments, making coffee, asking about her day, touching her shoulder lightly in passing, and then emotionally absent an hour later without transition. That inconsistency unsettled her more than the anger had. She told me he had gotten quieter. I asked what kind of quiet. She thought about it for a second before answering. The kind that feels like it's waiting for something. That was exactly right. Men like James depend on forward movement, their image, their networks, their influence over people. When those things stall, they don't collapse immediately. They become watchful. He sat across from my daughter every evening, still performing stability. Pleasant enough that nothing could be pointed to directly. Distant enough that she felt tension anyway, without fully understanding why. I had spent years around men like that. In meetings, in negotiations, in rooms where power shifted quietly beneath polite conversation. I knew what that stillness meant. It meant James was looking for his next move, and I understood by then that whatever came next would not stay small. She found it on a Thursday afternoon in the left pocket of his jacket. She wasn't looking for anything. Checking pockets before laundry was something she had done her entire adult life. A habit her mother had given her, actually. Back when she was 17 and ruined a good jacket by leaving a pen in the breast pocket. James knew she did it. He had watched her do it dozens of times in the years they had been together. The receipt was from a restaurant in Raleigh, dinner for two. The date on it was the Saturday of their anniversary weekend. The weekend James had told her he was attending a conference in Greensboro. She stood in the laundry room and read it twice. Then she turned it over as though the back might offer a different explanation. It didn't. She stood there for a long time. She didn't go to him. She didn't raise her voice down the hallway or appear in the doorway of whatever room he was in with the receipt in her hand, demanding an account. She thought about it. She felt the pull of it. That particular anger that wants to move immediately, that wants the confrontation to happen right now while the feeling is hot enough to carry her through it. She didn't move. Instead, she took out her phone, photographed the receipt under the laundry room light, and opened the locked folder. The wrist photograph was already in there. Now there were two. She put the physical receipt in the back of her own coat pocket, finished sorting the laundry, and started the machine. Then she called me. She didn't mention the receipt. She didn't mention the folder. She asked how I was doing. Just that, in the ordinary way. The way she used to open calls before James had reframed even that as something suspicious. I told her I was fine. I asked about her week. She said it had been long. I said mine too. We talked the way we used to talk on Sunday evenings before the Sundays stopped. Nothing urgent. Nothing that needed to be solved. Just two voices keeping each other company across the distance. I asked if she was eating properly. She said mostly. I told her I had seen something on television that reminded me of a film we used to watch together when she was in her 20s. She remembered it. We talked about that for a while. I didn't push. I didn't ask about James. I didn't leave any doors open that she would feel obligated to walk through. I just kept the line warm and easy and let her set the pace of every subject. When we hung up, I sat with the call for a moment. Something in it had been different, not in what she said, but in how she said it. The tightness that had been living in her voice for months had loosened slightly. Not gone, just loosened. She told me later what happened after she put the phone down. She sat on the edge of the bed and noticed that her shoulders had dropped. She hadn't realized until that moment that she had been holding them up near her ears for weeks. The call was the first time her body had let go of something since before the wedding. She wasn't ready to say she had been wrong. That would come. But something in her had quietly stopped choosing the wrong thing. She exhaled, slowly, in an empty room with no one watching. It was small. It was unwitnessed. And it was the beginning of her finding her way back. James noticed the shift in Lachette before she fully noticed it herself. That was always his gift. Reading people faster than they realized they were being read. It was the same quality that made him convincing in the beginning. That focused attention that made people feel deeply understood. What Lachette was only beginning to understand was that he used the same instinct in reverse, too. To feel people pulling away before they actually left. He cooked on a Friday evening. Nothing elaborate. Just the pasta dish he used to make early in their relationship. The one Lachette once told him reminded her of comfort. The apartment smelled warm when she walked in from work. James stood at the stove and smiled when he heard the door open. She told me later she had warned herself not to let one soft evening erase months of watching. When they sat down to eat, James talked carefully. Not dramatically. Carefully. He said losing his job had shaken him harder than he admitted. That he'd become angry and defensive and taken too much of that pressure out on her. He apologized for the distance. For the tension in the apartment, for making her feel alone while he unraveled. His voice sounded sincere in the practiced way some people learn sincerity after years of needing it to work. Then he brought up Atlanta. not as a confession, more as a man trying to control a story before someone else told it first. He said there had been a woman there years ago, someone connected professionally to his work. He claimed things between them became messy after he ended the relationship. That misunderstandings inside the company followed afterward and damaged his reputation more than they should have. He never admitted to fraud, never admitted to manipulation, but he kept circling the same language: vendor relationships, professional overlap, people trying to reinterpret situations after the fact. He said he had spent years afraid his past would eventually catch up to him in North Carolina. His eyes were wet when he finished. Lachette called me from the bathroom 40 minutes later with the door locked. She wasn't calling because she fully believed him, but she was wavering enough to scare herself, and I think part of her needed someone to steady the line she was starting to loosen. She told me everything he said. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I stayed quiet for a moment. "Tell me again the part about Atlanta," I said. "The woman." She repeated it. Slowly, this time. I asked exactly how he described her connection to his work, whether he mentioned vendors directly or if he kept speaking around it. Lachette thought for a second. "He kept saying professional overlap," she said quietly. "But he mentioned vendors once." I closed my eyes briefly. Then I said, "Lachette, listen to me carefully." I told her enough of the truth to matter. Not the entire documentation, not the compliance process, just the essential piece. The woman James had just described found me through Instagram 6 months before the wedding. She contacted me because she believed James had done this before. Reshaped stories, buried consequences, and moved cities before the full truth caught up. Everything happening to him now traced back to that contact. The line went silent. Not shocked, silence. Settling silence. "He doesn't know," I said quietly. "He still thinks nobody connected the pieces." Lachette didn't answer for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded different. Less emotional. More awake. "I'll call you tomorrow, Mama." This time, she wasn't wavering anymore. 3 days after the apology dinner, Lachette called me at 11 at night with 3 words. "You were right. I want to tell you what happened before that call." James had left his phone on the kitchen counter when he went to shower that evening. Lachette was moving around the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, not looking for anything, not suspicious in any active way, just present in the ordinary rhythm of an evening. The screen lit up. She glanced at it the way anyone glances at a screen that lights up nearby. The contact was saved as a single initial. She picked the phone up. She told me later she didn't make a decision to look. Her hands were simply already moving. She opened the thread. What she found was not a flirtation. It was not an old conversation someone had failed to delete. It was current, consistent, and intimate in a way that had its own entire history, its own references, its own language, its own version of James that ran parallel to the one Lachette had been living with. The other woman wrote the way people write when they believe they are loved, fully, without competition. The messages told the full story without meaning to. James kept telling the woman things were complicated at home, that Lachette depended on him more than people understood, that he was trying to handle things carefully before making changes. There were messages from the week of the wedding, warm ones, promising ones. There were messages from 2 days after it, talking about how everything would settle soon and how he just needed time. Lachette photographed every screen methodically. She went through the entire thread from the most recent message backward, screen by screen, and forwarded everything to her own number. Then she placed the phone back on the counter exactly as she had found it. Screen down, same angle, and walked to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't cry. She told me that, and I believed her because I know my daughter and I know the difference between the things that break her open and the things that simply close something inside her permanently. This was the second kind. The way a door closes when the person on the other side of it has finally understood there is nothing left to go back for. She sat there until she heard the shower cut off. Then she moved to the living room, turned on the television, and watched it without seeing it, while James came out and moved around the apartment and eventually told her he was going to bed. She said goodnight. She waited another hour. Then she called me. She didn't explain what she had found. She didn't go through the messages or describe the other woman or recount the details of what James had said. She just said it. You were right. 3 words carrying the full weight of 2 years. I didn't say I told you so. There was nothing in me that wanted to. I didn't ask her for details or push her toward anything in that moment. I said, "Okay, baby. Now we move." She exhaled, long and slow, like something she had been carrying for a long time had just been set down on my end of the line instead of hers. I had been ready for this call since the night of the dinner. I had known it was coming. I had known because I knew James, and I knew what men like him always eventually leave behind them. The question was never if. It was only ever when. Now I knew. We planned it across 4 days in phone calls that never lasted more than 10 minutes. Short calls were safer. James monitored duration without appearing to. She had noticed it months ago, the way his attention sharpened when she came off a long call, the questions that followed disguised as casual conversation. 10 minutes gave him nothing to work with. 10 minutes was just a daughter checking in on her mother. James still kept a Thursday networking meeting. No income, no prospects, no real reason to attend. But he went every week without fail because the meeting was one of the last places where people still treated him like the man he used to be. Pride is expensive that way. It kept him out of the apartment from 6 to at least 9. Thursday was our window. I pulled into the complex parking lot at 5:30 and sent her one message, one word: ready. She came down 2 trips, essentials only, her documents in a folder she had prepared 4 days earlier, her medication, 2 bags of clothes, and the locked phone with everything inside it. She moved quickly and without ceremony, the way people move when they have made a decision so completely that the body is simply catching up to what the mind already finished. She left her key on the kitchen counter beside the dish rack. That placement was deliberate. James always set his wallet there when he came through the door. He would come home, set his wallet down, and his hand would land next to her key before he understood what he was seeing. That moment of ordinary habit, interrupted by the thing that ended everything, that was what she chose to leave him with. Not a note, not an explanation, just a key in a familiar place that suddenly meant something irreversible. He called 18 times between 9:15 and midnight. Lachette was in her childhood room with the phone face down on the nightstand. She didn't answer once. She told me later she'd expected it to be harder, that the sound of his name on the screen would pull at something. It didn't. She said it felt like watching someone knock on a door to a house they no longer had the address to. I stayed up. I made tea I didn't particularly want and sat in the kitchen where I could hear both the front door and the hallway to her room. Not because I expected anything, just because it was her first night and I was her mother and sitting up was the only thing left I could do for her that evening. Around 1 a.m, the calls stopped. The apartment went fully quiet. I walked to her doorway and stood there for a moment. She was asleep, not collapsed, not curled into herself the way people sleep when grief has overwhelmed them. Just resting. Flat on her back, one arm at her side, breathing in the slow, even rhythm of someone whose body has finally been given permission to stop performing. She had been performing safety for so long, arranging her face, managing her reactions, calculating every word before it left her mouth. All of it, every day of it, exhausting in the way that only becomes visible once it stops. I went back to the kitchen, finished the tea, watched the door. It was not victory. Not yet. There was more coming, and I knew it. But it was the first real night of something that felt like the beginning of it. I watched the door until morning. 4 days after she left, Lachette came to find me in the kitchen with her phone already in her hand. She didn't say anything at first. She sat across from me at the table, placed the phone face down between us, and stared at it for a moment, before turning it over and sliding it toward me. I read the message once, then again. James had found what he believed was his last piece of leverage: private photographs Lachette had shared with him during the relationship. The kind people share when they believe they are safe with someone. His message was short, controlled, and carefully written to land exactly where he wanted it to. Come back, or he would release them. He named 2 people specifically, a cousin and a woman Lachette worked with. He wanted her imagining the fallout before anything had even happened. I set the phone down and looked at my daughter. She was holding herself very still. The shame had arrived before the anger. Not guilt. Lachette had nothing to feel guilty about. But the humiliation of realizing someone you trusted had quietly cataloged your vulnerability as future ammunition. She almost hadn't shown me the message. She admitted that after a while. Even now, there were things difficult to place in front of your mother. She had sat upstairs with the phone for nearly 2 hours before coming down. I was glad she did. "Has he sent anything yet?" I asked. She shook her head. She had already checked with both people he mentioned. Nothing had been sent. That mattered. Men like James often wanted compliance more than destruction. Once those photographs were released, he lost control of the threat. Right now, he was still trying to frighten her back into position. That was the window. "Good," I said quietly. "Then we still have time to move correctly." She looked at me carefully after that sentence. Not suspicious, exactly. More aware. Like she was beginning to understand that some of the calm she'd mistaken for passiveness these past months had actually been preparation. I picked up my phone and stepped into the hallway. The truth is, I did not already have the perfect contact waiting. After the wrist incident, I had started searching quietly because I understood James was escalating. But finding the right person took longer than I expected. One office referred me elsewhere. Another never returned my calls. One advocate told me plainly there was little they could do unless Lachette herself was ready to act. Eventually, someone connected me to a legal advocacy coordinator in Charlotte who agreed to speak with me informally. I had kept her number ever since. This was the first time I used it. Lachette watched me from the kitchen table while I spoke. I kept my voice level because panic confuses situations like this. Precision matters more. The woman on the phone asked practical questions. Had James distributed anything yet? Were there screenshots? Were there prior incidents documenting intimidation? Could Lachette safely access her accounts and devices? When I came back into the kitchen, Lachette was still watching me. "Who was that?" she asked. "Someone who can walk us through this the right way," I said. I sat back down and slid the phone toward her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I watched something shift in her face. Not relief, recognition. Like she was finally seeing clearly that I had not been moving emotionally all this time. I had been moving carefully. By 8 the following morning, Lachette was on a call with the advocacy attorney in Charlotte. I had not found her quickly. After the wrist incident, I spent days calling numbers that led nowhere, offices that never called back, referrals that turned into voicemail boxes. One woman who told me bluntly that without a police report, there was only so much anyone could do. The attorney Lachette finally reached was the fourth person I contacted and the first one who listened all the way through before speaking. I had spoken to her 3 weeks earlier because I understood enough about men like James to know that cornered men reach for whatever is left. The attorney walked Lachette through the reporting process carefully. She was also honest about the limits of it. A report alone would not stop James from doing anything. It created documentation, a timeline, a record that mattered if he escalated. That same afternoon, Lachette filed the report. The blocked doorway, the wrist, the bruise photograph from the locked folder, the controlled voice in her face followed by the word overreacting, the dates, the context. By the end of the day, his blackmail message was no longer floating in isolation. It existed beside a documented pattern of intimidation attached to legal representation. That was the first layer of the third move. The second layer was mine. I had been holding the complete Atlanta documentation since the day the woman who found me sent it to my inbox. The bid records, vendor payments, internal communications. The pattern James had spent years pretending wasn't a pattern. I had already used parts of it carefully. The compliance review that cost him his job. The quiet conversations that damaged his recovery prospects. I had never released everything because I had never been certain how far James would go. Now I was. Even then, the attorney cautioned me against making emotional threats we couldn't support legally. We spent nearly an hour tightening language, removing assumptions, sticking only to what could be documented and verified. That mattered. By late afternoon, a formal communication was sent to James's attorney. Precise, controlled. Any further harassment, direct contact, third-party pressure, or distribution of private images would trigger immediate escalation, including submission of the Atlanta documentation to the relevant licensing board and to parties already connected to the earlier procurement investigation. Not promises, not dramatics, just consequences attached to evidence. The attorney told us there was still no guarantee it would stop him. Men like James sometimes escalate anyway. But now he would do it, understanding there was a documented trail waiting for him on the other side. I want to tell you what it looked like when everything Lachette had gathered finally sat together in one place. The wrist photograph she took without fully understanding why. The Raleigh receipt from the laundry room. The screenshots forwarded from James's phone while he showered. The locked folder she had been building piece by piece while still trying to convince herself her marriage could survive. She had been documenting him long before she admitted to herself that she needed protection. James received the communication that evening. For 2 hours, there was nothing. Then one message arrived, not to Lachette, to the attorney. 3 lines, angry, careful, denying everything while suddenly sounding very aware of consequences. After that, silence. No calls, no threats, no images sent to anyone. Just silence. Not the performing kind, not the watching kind. The kind that comes from a man realizing for the first time that the people around him are no longer afraid in the way he needs them to be. That silence was the loudest thing I had heard in months. I made a decision the morning after James went silent. Lachette did not need to watch what happened next. Not because she couldn't handle it. She already had. But there is a kind of freedom that comes from no longer tracking the downfall of the person who hurt you. I wanted her to experience the end of James not as entertainment or revenge, but as distance. Quiet distance that kept widening on its own. So when information started reaching her, and it did, because people always talk, I redirected it gently. You don't need that. Let it go. For the first time, she listened without resistance. What happened to James, Almarin followed mostly from a distance. The woman from the parallel relationship surfaced within 2 weeks. She had genuinely believed she was the real future. The woman James planned to build with once he was free of the marriage he kept describing as temporary. When she realized the wedding had happened while he was still making promises to her, she reacted badly. Publicly enough that people around them started connecting pieces James had spent years keeping separated. Not everyone immediately believed it. That mattered. One former colleague defended him at first. Another said the Atlanta situation had probably been exaggerated. But then more details surfaced. Screenshots, dates that lined up too cleanly, stories from people who had quietly stopped trusting him long before any of this became visible. That was how the shift really happened. Not all at once, not dramatically. Confidence in him simply started thinning out room by room. Calls stopped being returned. Networking meetings became uncomfortable. One consulting conversation he had been trying to revive disappeared after 2 postponed meetings and a final email that never received a reply. A month later, he left Charlotte entirely. Not publicly, not dramatically. One of the mutual contacts Lachette used to work with mentioned hearing he had taken a temporary position outside the city through someone who barely knew him. Smaller company, lower pay, no real standing attached to it. The Atlanta documentation sitting in an attorney's possession complicated everything further. Nobody wanted to step into business with a man carrying unresolved procurement allegations and active legal pressure around harassment and blackmail threats. North Carolina had been his clean start because nobody there knew what happened in Atlanta. Now enough people did. He still wasn't ruined overnight. I want to be honest about that. Men like James rarely collapse in one cinematic moment. They shrink gradually. Opportunities narrow. Rooms cool toward them. The version of themselves they built stops working as effectively as it used to. That was what was happening to him. Pieces still reached Lachette sometimes. A mutual contact mentioning he'd moved out of the apartment. Someone at work casually asking if the rumors were true. Once, a message from an unknown number that simply read, "He did the same thing to her too." Each time she came to me, I answered the same way. "You don't need that. Let it go." One evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said quietly, "Mama, I don't feel anything. I thought I would feel something by now." She wasn't upset by it, just surprised. I looked at her for a moment. "That's not nothing," I said. "That's peace starting." She sat with that quietly, then nodded once like something had settled into place inside her. Later that night, I passed her bedroom doorway. She was standing at the window of her childhood room, not crying, not staring at her phone, not replaying old messages or searching for updates about James, just standing there in the quiet. In a house where nobody was monitoring her tone, nobody recalculating her emotions for leverage, nobody waiting for her to become smaller so they could feel larger. Just quiet. I kept walking. She didn't need me in that moment. That was the point. I came downstairs on a Sunday morning and my daughter had made my coffee. It was such a small thing. She stood at the counter with her back to me the same way she used to when she came home from college during her first year. Still halfway between girl and woman. Still learning herself. The coffee was already poured. She had remembered exactly how I take it. That was the thing that almost undid me. Not the wedding. Not the phone calls. Not even the silence that came after. Just a cup of coffee made correctly by someone who still remembered me underneath everything that had happened. I sat down, and she brought both mugs to the table. Morning light came through the kitchen window in the same slant it always had on Sundays. Neither of us spoke for a moment. It was ordinary. The kind of ordinary people underestimate until they almost lose it. Finally, she set her cup down. "I should have listened," she said quietly. "I knew something was wrong before the wedding. I just kept telling myself I was imagining it. I'm sorry, Mama." She didn't soften it with excuses, no blaming stress, no blaming love. Just the truth placed gently on the table between us. I looked at my daughter. This woman I had watched drift away one careful conversation at a time. This woman who had started missing Sunday calls and repeating James's opinions back to me like they were her own thoughts. This woman who had stood in a laundry room holding evidence and still wasn't ready to name what she already knew. And this same woman sitting across from me now. Back. I know, I said, and you don't have to keep punishing yourself for it. Her eyes lifted at that. I think part of her expected me to want more suffering from her, more apology, more guilt to balance what had happened between us. But that was never what I wanted. I wanted my daughter back. She exhaled slowly and picked up her coffee again. We sat quietly for another minute before I mentioned a recipe I hadn't made in years. Something complicated enough to take all afternoon and enough counter space for two people to work side by side without bumping elbows. She looked up. Can I help? Two small words carrying everything underneath them. The lost Sundays, the distance, the missed holidays. The way James had slowly positioned himself at the center of every room until everyone else had to shrink around him. I thought about the dinner table where this started, the drive home afterward, the message from Atlanta that arrived during my lunch break and changed the direction of everything that came after it. And I thought about how easily this story could have ended differently if Lachette had stayed 1 month longer, maybe even 1 week longer. That was the part I still felt sometimes when the house got quiet enough. Not anger, just the awareness of how close we came to losing more than we did. I picked up my coffee cup and looked at my daughter across the table. Then I smiled. "We're still here, baby," I said. "That's what matters."